You know that moment when you're sitting with someone and the conversation just stops. Maybe you've run out of things to say, or maybe you're both just thinking. And suddenly there's this silence hanging in the air between you, and you can feel it. You can actually feel the quiet pressing down on you. And what do? If you're like most people, you scramble to fill it. You blurt out something, anything, even if it's completely random. So, crazy weather we're having, right? Even though the weather is perfectly normal and you don't care about it at all. You just needed to kill the silence before it killed you. I used to be terrified of silence. Absolutely terrified. I'd go to parties and feel this overwhelming pressure to keep talking, keep the energy up, never let there be a gap. I'd be on a first date and the moment there was a pause, I'd panic and start rambling about something ridiculous. I once spent 10 minutes talking about the history of traffic lights because I couldn't handle 15 seconds of quiet. The person I was with probably thought I was insane. And maybe I was, a little bit. But I wasn't alone in this fear. Not even close. Silence makes people deeply uncomfortable. There's actually research on this. Scientists did an experiment where they put people in a room alone with nothing but their thoughts for 15 minutes. Just sitting quietly. No phone, no book, nothing. Seems easy enough, right? Here's the wild part. They also gave participants the option to give themselves a mild electric shock if they got too bored. And a significant number of people, we're talking about 67% of men and 25% of women, chose to shock themselves rather than sit in silence with their own thoughts. They literally chose physical pain over quiet. Let that sink in for a moment. We're so afraid of silence, so uncomfortable with stillness, that we'd rather hurt ourselves than experience it. But why? What is it about silence that freaks us out so much? I think part of it is that we live in a world that's relentlessly noisy. Think about your average day. You wake up to an alarm. You check your phone before you even get out of bed, notifications pinging, messages waiting, the world demanding your attention. You put on music or a podcast while you get ready. You scroll through social media while you eat breakfast. You drive to work with the radio on. At work, there's the hum of computers, colleagues talking, emails chiming. You eat lunch while watching videos on your phone. You come home and turn on the TV for background noise. Even when you're trying to relax, there's something playing. We've engineered silence almost completely out of our lives. And when you're that used to constant stimulation, constant noise, silence feels wrong. It feels unnatural. It's like when you're in a city your whole life and then you visit the countryside at night, and the darkness is so complete it's unsettling. You're not used to it. Your nervous system doesn't know what to do with it. But I think it goes deeper than just being unaccustomed to quiet. Silence forces us to face something we spend most of our lives running from. Ourselves. When everything goes quiet, when there's no distraction, no noise to hide behind, you're left alone with your thoughts. And for a lot of people, that's a scary place to be. Because thoughts can be messy. They can be painful. They can be confusing. When you're constantly distracted, you can push uncomfortable feelings down, ignore nagging worries, avoid questions you don't want to answer. But in silence, all that stuff rises to the surface. The thing you're anxious about at work. The relationship issue you've been avoiding. The dream you gave up on. The person you miss. The mistake you made. All of it comes bubbling up when you're quiet. I remember the first time I really noticed this. I'd gone on this hiking trip by myself, trying to be all contemplative and find myself or whatever. And I was walking through this beautiful forest, completely alone, no cell service, just me and nature. And instead of feeling peaceful, I felt anxious. My mind was racing. I was thinking about every embarrassing thing I'd ever said, every deadline I was worried about, every insecurity I had. It was like my brain, finally given space to breathe, decided to throw up every uncomfortable thought it had been storing. And I realized, oh, this is why I always have headphones in. This is why I always need the TV on. I'm not enjoying the noise. I'm hiding from the silence. There's also this social aspect to our fear of silence that's really interesting. We've been taught that silence in conversation is awkward. It means someone messed up. It means you're boring. It means the other person isn't interested. Think about how we describe uncomfortable silences. We say they're deafening, or awkward, or painful. We've literally pathologized normal human pauses. And so we feel this pressure to perform, to be entertaining, to keep things moving, because if we don't, we've somehow failed. I see this all the time in professional settings. People in meetings who clearly have nothing to add but feel like they need to say something anyway because silence might make them look disengaged. Presentations where the speaker is terrified of pausing for even a second because they think the audience will lose interest. Job interviews where both people are scrambling to fill every gap because they think silence equals failure. We've created this culture where being comfortable with silence is almost seen as a social skill deficit. But here's what's fascinating. In many other cultures, silence isn't feared at all. It's valued. In Finland, for example, silence is considered a natural part of conversation. People pause. They think before they speak. Nobody panics. In Japan, there's a concept called ma, which is about the space between things, including the space between words. Silence isn't empty. It's full of possibility. It's where meaning lives. Some Native American cultures view silence as a sign of respect and thoughtfulness. The idea that you need to fill every moment with sound would seem strange, even rude. So our fear of silence isn't universal human nature. It's cultural. It's learned. Which means it can be unlearned. I started trying to get more comfortable with silence a couple years ago, and honestly, it was harder than I expected. I started small. I'd go for walks without headphones. Just me and my footsteps and the sounds of the neighborhood. At first, it was torture. My brain was like, what are we doing? Where's the podcast? Where's the music? We're going to be bored. But I stuck with it. And gradually, something shifted. I started noticing things. The sound of wind in the trees. Birds I'd never paid attention to before. My own breathing. My own thoughts, yeah, but not in that overwhelming way. More like, oh, that's what I'm thinking about. Interesting. Then I started experimenting with silence in conversations. This was even harder. Someone would stop talking, and instead of immediately jumping in, I'd just wait. Let the pause sit there. And you know what I discovered? Most of the time, the other person would continue. They'd add something deeper, something more honest than what they'd first said. It was like the silence gave them permission to go beyond the surface-level stuff. Or sometimes they'd ask me a question, and the conversation would go in a more interesting direction than it would have if I'd filled the space with my own chatter. There was this moment with my dad that really drove this home. We were sitting on his porch one evening, and we'd been talking, and then we just stopped. And normally, I would have panicked and said something. But I didn't. I just sat there. And the silence stretched out. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5 minutes. And it wasn't awkward. We were just sitting together, watching the sunset, being present. And then my dad said something he'd never told me before, something important about his own father. And I realized, if I'd filled that silence with noise, would have missed that moment entirely. I think part of why silence is so powerful is that it creates space for truth. When you're constantly talking, constantly stimulating yourself, constantly moving, you can stay on the surface of things. You can keep relationships superficial. You can avoid the deep stuff. But silence has a way of bringing depth whether you're ready for it or not. This is something I've noticed in my own inner life too. The things I really need to process, the feelings I really need to feel, they don't come when I'm busy and distracted. They come in the quiet moments. In the shower, when I'm not looking at my phone. On a long drive with no music. Right before sleep, when the day finally stops demanding things from me. And yeah, sometimes what comes up is uncomfortable. Sometimes it's grief I haven't processed or anxiety I've been ignoring or sadness I've been pushing down. But those feelings don't go away just because I'm avoiding them. They just build up. And silence gives them a release valve. There's actually science behind this too. When we're constantly stimulated, constantly taking in information, our brains don't have time to process it all. We go into what neuroscientists call a state of continuous partial attention, where we're sort of paying attention to everything but not really deeply engaged with anything. But when we have quiet time, when we let ourselves be bored, our brains shift into what's called the default mode network. This is when we consolidate memories, make connections between ideas, engage in self-reflection, and imagine the future. It's not wasted time. It's when some of our most important mental work happens. So when we fill every moment with noise and distraction, we're not just avoiding discomfort. We're actually preventing our brains from doing necessary maintenance. We're like a computer that never shuts down to install updates. Eventually, things start to glitch. I also think our fear of silence is tied to our fear of being alone with who we really are. Because in silence, you can't pretend to be someone else. You can't perform. You can't curate your image. You're just you, with all your contradictions and flaws and weirdness and wounds. And if you've spent your whole life running from that person, if you've learned to only value yourself based on what you produce or how you entertain others or how well you meet other people's expectations, then being alone with yourself feels terrifying. I had a therapist once who asked me, "Do you like yourself?" And I was like, "Of course I do." And she said, "Then why do you avoid spending time with yourself?" And I didn't have a good answer. Because she was right. I couldn't stand to be alone without distraction. And that was telling me something important. I didn't actually enjoy my own company. I'd rather be anywhere, doing anything, than just sitting with myself. That was a hard realization. But it was also the beginning of something important. Because I started asking myself, what would it take for me to actually enjoy my own company? What would I need to accept about myself? What would I need to let go of? What would I need to change? And slowly, very slowly, I started to get more comfortable in my own skin. I started to see silence not as this enemy to be defeated but as this space where I could actually hear myself think. Where I could check in with how I was really feeling instead of just powering through. Where I could let my mind wander and see what it came up with. Now, I'm not saying silence is always comfortable. Sometimes it's still hard. Sometimes what comes up in the quiet is really painful or difficult. But I've learned that discomfort isn't the same as danger. Just because something feels bad doesn't mean it's hurting me. Sometimes the most uncomfortable stuff is actually the most necessary. There's this quote I love by Blaise Pascal, this 17th century philosopher. He said, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." And I used to think that was a bit dramatic. But the more I think about it, the more I see the truth in it. Because so much of what we do, the way we distract ourselves, the way we numb ourselves, the way we avoid ourselves, it creates suffering. Not just for us, but for the people around us. When you can't sit with your own discomfort, you're more likely to lash out at others. When you can't face your own feelings, you're more likely to project them onto people who don't deserve it. When you're constantly running from yourself, you can't be fully present for anyone else. Your relationships stay shallow because you're staying shallow. But when you can sit with silence, when you can be with yourself without needing to escape, something shifts. You become more grounded. More authentic. More able to be present with other people's pain without needing to fix it or avoid it. You become, I think, more fully human. I'm not suggesting everyone needs to become a meditation guru or take a vow of silence or anything extreme like that. But I do think most of us could benefit from getting a little more comfortable with quiet. From not always needing something playing in the background. From being okay with pauses in conversation. From spending some time alone without our devices, just being. Start small if the idea freaks you out. Maybe it's just 5 minutes in the morning with your coffee before you check your phone. Maybe it's a walk around the block without headphones once a week. Maybe it's letting a silence sit in conversation without rushing to fill it. Maybe it's turning off the TV when you're eating dinner and just being with your food and your thoughts. Pay attention to what comes up. You might be surprised. You might find that in the absence of constant noise, you actually have thoughts worth listening to. Ideas you've been too distracted to notice. Feelings you've been too busy to feel. Dreams you've been too occupied to dream. Or maybe you'll just be bored. And you know what? That's okay too. Boredom isn't the end of the world. It's actually kind of important. It's the fertile ground where creativity grows. It's what motivates us to engage with life instead of just consuming it. Every great idea, every work of art, every meaningful change started with someone who was bored enough to imagine something different. The thing about silence is that it's not actually empty. It's not nothing. It's full of everything you've been too busy to notice. It's full of yourself, which is sometimes uncomfortable but ultimately necessary. It's full of the present moment, which is the only moment you actually have. It's full of possibility, of space for something new to emerge. And yeah, sometimes what emerges is uncomfortable. Sometimes it's anxiety or sadness or regret. But sometimes it's peace. Sometimes it's clarity. Sometimes it's a solution to a problem you've been wrestling with. Sometimes it's just a deep breath and a sense of being okay exactly as you are. I think we fear silence because we've forgotten what it has to offer. We've been taught that it's empty, awkward, something to be avoided. But that's not true. Silence is where you meet yourself. It's where you process your life. It's where you find out what you actually think and feel instead of just absorbing what everyone else is telling you. So maybe the question isn't why do some people fear silence? Maybe the question is, what are we so afraid we'll find in the quiet? And what would it mean to be brave enough to find out? Because I can tell you from experience, what you find in silence isn't the enemy. It's you. And you're worth listening to.